Going to
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Matisse Dupont. I'm the Director of Engagement Advancement for the History Project, and we are here for tonight's Curator Talk, Expanding Queer Narratives in Historical Museums, with curators R. Tripp Evans, Meghan Gelardi Holmes, and Kenneth Turino for a discussion on incorporating queer narratives into museums. Just in case anyone's new here to the History Project, well, welcome. We're Boston's queer community archives. We're dedicated to sharing, preserving, and documenting Boston's queer history. So if you're at all interested in queer history in general, LGBTQ plus history, Boston history, please feel free to follow us on Instagram. You can also sign up for our newsletter. I'm just going to pop a bunch of links in the chat right now. Our newsletter, and also you can see our link tree that has basically everything on it that you need. So it would be awesome if you came to more of our events and you know came to our stuff. Yeah, we're the History Project. We're so happy to have you. One other little plug. We are indeed a 501(c)(3 profit nonprofit. We are both grant funded, but also we are funded by community donations. So I'm also putting one final link to donate to the History Project if you want to help us preserve, document, and share Boston's LGBTQ plus history. And without further ado, let's go to tonight's event. It's my pleasure to introduce to you our curators, Ken, Meghan, and Tripp. Everyone give them a round of applause virtually. And Ken, you are up first.
okay. Thank you, Matisse. I'm delighted to be here and to be part of this, and thank you all for coming on this early spring evening for us on our presentation on expanding queer narratives and historical museums. What we hope to do tonight is give you some insight with our first presentations about how museums are working with interpreting queer history. We're focused mainly on historic sites, and you'll hear that. And also the main feature is going to be Tripp Evans talking about the importance of being furnished. And you'll hear more about that in a second. I just need to make this advance, so bear with me. There we go. So I want to start out with this from a recent exhibition. I've shared this with Matisse before. Let me step back and say, I forgot to introduce myself, Ken Turino. I, for 24 years, was manager of community partnerships and resource at Historic New England. You'll hear more about them in Tripp's presentation and mine in just a minute. I'm also been involved with the History Project for years as a friend of Vera. But I wanted to share you this, and I've shared this with Tripp, and I've also shared this with Matisse. One of my students, Patrick Lambone from Harvard, shared this with me, and I think it's a really good way of how I refer to the word queer in my discussions here, and you'll hear that. So I'm just putting that up for your reference. I just think it's a really good one. And I want to talk a little bit about how LGBTQ plus stories have become more visible and inclusive at history museums through exhibitions and program. I'm going to put this in a broader perspective and give you insight on the background of interpreting queer history. I'm going to focus, my work has been at Historic New England, and give you an indication of how we got to this, quote, important exhibition. Now, I wanted to tell you, this is from Susie Wilkening, who is a researcher who originally from lived in Massachusetts and now is out in Seattle working with the American Alliance of Museums. And she does surveys, nationwide surveys. And what we found is that people really want to hear these stories. And they want museums to be inclusive. And our queer brothers, sisters, and they visit the widest variety of museums, and you can see right here. And they're most likely to feel seen in museums by having their perspectives represented. And that's what I feel, especially with all that's going on today, that we really need to be adamant about that to see that we are represented in museums. I think it's absolutely essential that we're doing that, and we continue to fight that battle. And in many cases, it's been a battle. I throw up this slide because for those of you who are interested in history, this was an issue of the Public Historian. You can find it at libraries, that devoted an entire issue to queering public history. And a lot of that relates to museums. And I really recommend it if you can get your hands on it for those people really interested in history. Now, I said I worked for Historic New England for 24 years. These are their properties throughout New England. They have faced challenges and overcome them in telling queer stories, but this really takes time. There are challenges to telling a more complex story, and these have ranged at different properties to the administration in the past saying there's lack of proof, to stakeholders involved with the museum not wanting these stories told. So this is the reality of museums that I think you need to understand. Now, let's see, let me get the date right. This is Bowman House, Historic New England's most recently opened museum, and it was saved by a designer and historic preservationist and entrepreneur, Bill Waters, and his partner, Cyrus Parker. He gave the property in 1971, but they had life tenancy, and in 2021, the Historic New England opened the house as a museum under the name Bowman House. At that time, there was no question that the house would be interpreted as the house of queer men. So that's very, very forward thinking. Now let's go back in time. Some of you with the History Project, and you'll see we visited this as a group several times. Beauport, overlooking Gloucester Harbor, was the summer home of interior designer Henry Davis Sleeper. And if you go there, you will hear more about this from Tripp, but you will see 27 of the 40 rooms in the house. The most common question from visitors when they were visiting this house was Sleeper gay? The required response in the past had been, well, he never married. And I should mention that Sleeper's personal papers were most likely destroyed by the family. They do not exist. So that was a big question about how we do that. Here you have Sleeper, and I'm not going to talk too much about him because Tripp will go into much more detail about this in his exhibition. The reason I want to bring this up is because over the years, Historic New England decided that there was proof and enough to interpret this house, as that of a gay man. And we'll come back and hear more about that. The interpretation has varied. Sarah Orne Jewett's house in South Berwick, Maine, which I hope someday we can bring the History Project to because it's just over the border. And this tour of this property, Boston Marriage had been a part of the tour where they talked about Sarah Orne Jewett and her partner, Annie Fields. But one of the past administrators saw that over time, that was actually dropped out. And they were not talking about the relationship between the two women. But it was put back in the tour by Brooke Steinhauser, then site manager. And now they've expanded on that to tell a more complete story using their love letters between these two women to tell the story about their deep relationship, and been able to talk about that in their magazine, but also through a lot of programming here and partnering with queer organizations in Maine and the Seacoast region. So this has really been a change and growth over time for the organization. Codman House has been a little bit more difficult because there were family members involved, and this is part of the politics of museum, who didn't really want the story told, and donors. And there were times where staff were instructed, just hold your horses, we'll get there. We'll be able to tell the story eventually. And we did make some inroad over the years. We hosted programs by Douglas Shantucci speaking on his book, Boston Bohemia. And we started talking about at these programs about Codman. His letter survived. You'll hear more about that from Tripp. His correspondence with his best friend, Philip Little, who did that nice little, I think it was going to be a book plate, right, Tripp, on the right-hand side for that he designed for Codman. We had David Doyle out for the History Project to speak on his work, A Very Proper Bostonian, Rediscovering Odmund Codman in His Late 19th Century Queer World. So we followed that up with the History Project collaborating, and that's really important to get the word out there by doing queer tours, and you see some of that there. And the site managers had to really walk a fine line with telling these stories and working with the stakeholders and donors. And it's taken quite a number of years to fully tell the story, but I'm really happy as part of the exhibition that the Codman House has now initiated a queer tour. That was last year in 2024, and we're hoping to partner and do that with the History Project in the coming year. So very important. So the partnership that we've had with the History Project, we being Historic New England, has been extremely, extremely important. And we use that to do walking tours over the years at Eastern Point, and also just to create a fun event where we could get together and celebrate queer history and talk about it. There's Tripp before the exhibition opened, but this was something that I think the Beauport, and if I hope many of you have visited it, will see that it's an amazing site with amazing stories to tell. And there's nothing like being there. So they've done specific Pride tours, not just offered during Pride, but these are offered regularly. And I think that's an important part of what we need to do to get the word out. They've also made themselves a gay-friendly place for weddings and for hosting other queer organizations to come. The organization, as I mentioned, had a little bit of a rocky history, Historic New England, in terms of where they were telling stories and why, because of donors and so on. But there's been real progress, and they aren't doing it just at those queer sites that I've mentioned, but also in downtown Boston, out of the Otis House, did queer walking tours, again, in partnership with the History Project, and that included a queer walking tour of Beacon Hill. And we really, with the help of the curatorial staff, made a real effort to tell everyone's stories in our exhibition. So this was an exhibition on jewelry, but the image you see on the right corner were actually rings from a gay couple before marriage, commemoration rings that became part of the collection and are part of that exhibition. So I think anything we can do to incorporate these stories more fully into our museums makes a lot of sense. And this was an exhibition called Head to Toe about shoes and hats. And the curator then, Laura Johnson, amazing, made sure that she included queer stories and went out and sought these boots, which were used in P-Town. I think it's kind of funny because I had suggested a different title. I had suggested that we call this exhibition Tops and Bottoms, but I got shot down on that. But Head to Toe worked well enough for us. But just a real effort to make sure that we're being more inclusive. I'm really hoping that we're still able to do this in the future. I know the National Park Service, for example, the Longfellow House, which has made real inroads in telling queer stories, is facing challenges with what's happening with the new administration, the whole Park Service. But those of us who can are going to keep with our fight. So with that, I'm going to, all of this work that I talked to you about culminated in the exhibition that Tripp is going to tell you in just a few minutes. And I am going to finish here. My goal was just to give you a little bit of an introduction of what took place to make this exhibition possible. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Meghan, who can talk to you about another story. So, Meghan, you are up next.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Matisse and the History Project and Ken and Tripp for including me in this conversation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we have thought about doing this work at the Gibson House Museum. And I think a lot of what I say will echo what Ken has said already about how things have happened at Historic New England and other sites. So for those who haven't been, this is the Gibson House. We're located in the Back Bay in Boston. The house was built in 1859, and 3 generations of the Gibson family and their domestic staff lived there between 1860 and 1954. So it's not that the Gibsons themselves were particularly notable in some way. It's that we have all of their things in the place where they lived and used them. And so it's a really great time capsule of late 19th, early 20th century life. So the focus for today is really Charles Hammond Gibson Jr., who we affectionately refer to as Charlie. He was born in 1874, and he's really one of the 3rd generation of Gibsons to live at the house. He was a writer. He was a gay man. He had a relationship with a man named Maurice de Mauny, which we have always known about, and other relationships that we sort of learned about thanks to Tripp's research, which you'll hear more about. It was his project to turn his family home into a museum. So in many ways, he's really the first curator of the house. And you can see on the left here, this is a tour that he wrote of one of the rooms. On the right, I'm calling out 3 portraits of himself as a young man that he placed over the fireplace in his family's library in the 1940s. So he's shaping his family's home, and you can't really understand the Gibson House unless you know that he was a gay man, and he's doing this project to sort of celebrate his life as a writer, but also the history of Boston in his youth, and sort of being the young hot thing in this queer community during his youth. And that's sort of what he's celebrating in these images. And so the Gibson House has always been a queer space, but the museum has not always acknowledged that or interpreted it. And so I thought what I would do is talk a little bit about how that has happened over the course of the house's history as a museum. So Charlie Gibson died in 1954. He had spent 20 years of his life turning the house into a museum, or sort of thinking about it as a museum. And it opened to the public just 3 years after his death in 1957. And you can see, so these are some images from the early years of the house kind of advertising itself to visitors. These are Emerson grads who they hired to pose at various places in the house. Charlie's story, and Charlie himself, is really pretty immediately sidelined, pushed to the side, kind of seen by early museum staff as problematic, as not what the museum wanted to be focusing on. So they're really leaning in here to the house as Victoriana. But Charlie's story has always been known. It was known in Boston in his own time. It has long been known by, folks like Ken and Tripp and other scholars who have been working on this story, and by the museum itself, by family members, by museum staff. And it's really been a push and pull, a tug about how much the museum would sort of dig into that history. I was talking to a board member a couple years ago who told me, oh, we did a program in the 1990s called He Was Out in the Gay 90s, referring to the 1890s. But then I call out a quote here from Harvard Magazine I think this is from 2015, from a staff member who sort of gets asked about Charlie's sexual orientation and says, we're not touching that. That's his business, not ours. Which is sort of an example about it, from, in my opinion anyway, how at a small institution, it really doesn't take much to, just a few folks, right, to impede progress or sort of ignore or resist, existing knowledge. And really, in many ways, visitors push the museum to kind of reckon with this history. So for a long time, you visit the Gibson House primarily by guided tour. So for a long time, there was a lot of coded language being used on the tour. Like Charlie was a confirmed bachelor. He was a bohemian. He was eccentric, and the stories we were telling, many of them lean into the stereotype of a gay man, but people were paying attention to that. Really close with his mom, and there's evidence of that in the house. His mother's bedroom is sort of remains pristine, almost a shrine to her. His father's bedroom, he kind of disappeared, turned into his personal study. Here's a man who's interested in interior design and art. He's curating these spaces. He writes poetry about unrequited love. He never married. Like visitors were like, sort of what Ken was talking about at Beauport. Like, was he gay? Like, clearly, this is what you're saying. And guides were in a tricky position. There was no museum sort of language about this, and so they didn't know what to say. The museum didn't have any way of saying it. And really that was a disservice. It's a disservice to the history, to the community, certainly to our visitors. And so we got kind of an opening in 2018. Boston Pride reached out and said, would you write an article for our Pride Guide talking about this history? Like, we know it's out there. We've heard stories about this. Like, can you write something? And I was sort of new to the museum. I jumped at the chance to be able to sort of collect together what we did know, the sources that we had in our own, archival collection, and be able to kind of put that out there. And that allowed us to rewrite the main house, the sort of standard house tour, so that every visitor heard Charlie Gibson was a gay man, so that there wasn't this confusion, like, confirmed bachelor. People were like, what are we talking about here? And so that felt really important to kind of correct that language and to think about how we were going to sort of lean into this history and be really clear that we weren't going to do this back and forth anymore. We were going to interpret this. And then, Tripp was working on, this book project exhibition that later became this exhibition project, The Importance of Being Furnished, and so generously shared all of his research with us, which, we had some source material in our own collection, but then it turned out that there was, and I won't say a ton about this, Tripp, you'll say more, all of this fantastic material in the papers of Ogden Codman Jr. At Historic New England that really placed Charlie square in this, queer community in Boston. And so we thought, okay, every visitor who's coming is hearing that he's a gay man, but there is a much bigger story here. We didn't want his story to just be, one room in the house, which is sort of how it works on the house tour. So we spent, 2018 into 2019 working on a specialty tour called Charlie Gibson's Queer Boston. And we wrote that with an advisory committee who generously volunteered their time, and it was really successful. We launched it during Pride in 2019. I had one visitor say to me, listen, if I had known there was a gay story here, I would have come a lot sooner. And that was really gratifying to hear. Like, people wanted this history, and it was both doing good work, good history, but also I hardly need to tell this audience that it was making space for, this community to hear their story, to feel seen. And that we were really proud to be able to do that work. And it hasn't just been visitors, it's been our guides, our staff who are coming, interns who say, I want to be part of this. I'm so glad you're telling this story. So I think, I'll just say that now the work for us is really, how do we embed this story into all of our work, so it never sort of goes back to that kind of push-pull of, are we doing this, are we not doing this? And so it is my commitment that nobody can come into the Gibson House without hearing Charlie Gibson was a gay man, that this is a queer space, this is a queer museum. But also, we're offering Charlie Gibson's Queer Boston regularly, and we offer it 2 times a month. We're trying to do related programming to sort of expand, our sort of, our footprint in this space. And if I can just close by echoing what Ken said, I think in this moment in particular, private museums like the Gibson House, we don't get a lot of federal funding. That's not something that we necessarily rely on. And so I think we have to speak especially loudly right now as, like our colleagues at Longfellow House, other National Park Service sites, places that are really reliant on federal funding, can't do. And so I think that's our work right now. So I'll stop there, but happy to answer questions in the chat. Thank you. And I'll turn it over to Tripp.
Great. Thank you. Let me open mine up. Great. Can everybody, did it work successfully?
No, you have to try sharing your screen again. Oh, there it's
How's
loading.
that
It's loading. There we go. Perfect. You got it.
Great. Grandpa got it. Hey everyone, great to be a part of this group. My name is Tripp Evans. I'm a professor of American Art and Architecture at Wheaton College in Massachusetts. And I am the author of the book, The Importance of Being Furnished, and I was the curator of the show of the same name that was sponsored by Historic New England, but it was in partnership with the Gibson House Museum and with the Rhode Island School of Design Museum. It is wonderful to be able to revisit this project. Obviously, the show closed in October. The book is still out there. I'm still actually touring around and lecturing about it. And it is really wonderful tonight to see in this group that there are two folks who helped inspire the project from the beginning, including Hannah Barrett, whose work we're going to be seeing a little bit later on, and Will Fellows. Will, I had no idea you were going to be on this. Matisse, if you could somehow throw up in the chat, Will Fellows wrote a wonderful book about gay men's role in preservation, and it's called A Passion to Preserve. So that was one of the guiding lights for me at the beginning of this project. So let me tell you a little bit about this project, this book and museum project that mirrored one another. Obviously, the museum project was a bit more object driven. It looks at the lives of four men, two of whom you've met tonight with Meghan and Ken, Henry Davis Sleeper and Ogden Codman Jr. The other two are Charles Pendleton oh, I'm sorry. So you've met actually three of them. Ogden Codman and Henry Davis came through Ken's talk, Charlie Gibson through Meghan. Charles Pendleton is the wild card here. But let me just, for the sake of reintroducing them, go kind of left to right here, give you a sense of who we're talking about, and then I'll introduce you to the houses that are most closely connected with them. So Charles Pendleton was a great collector of 18th century furniture and established really one of the first kind of period room collections at the RISD Museum in Providence. Ogden Codman Jr., the great designer and interior decorator of his period, especially for Gilded Age clients. Charlie Gibson, who you've just heard about from Meghan, quite a prolific writer, also a member of kind of a storied Boston Brahmin family. And then last, Henry Davis Sleeper, who himself became quite a sort of celebrated interior designer in his own right. So the book and the show focused on the ways in which these four men created kind of lives for themselves within their own homes. And I'll just show these to you quickly so you can have kind of a visual for them. Pendleton House at the RISD Museum is a recreation of Pendleton's home, which is a couple of blocks away, built by the RISD Museum to house his collection of furniture. The Codman Estate at Center was home to 5 generations of Codmans and was last redecorated by Ogden Codman Jr. In its kind of final incarnation. But the house was originally built by an ancestor of his in the mid-18th century. The Gibson House Museum, you've just heard about from Meghan in Boston's Back Bay. It was built by Gibson's grandmother and then later preserved by him as a museum project. And then last, Beauport. Beauport is so large, it really requires kind of its own slide. It started as a somewhat modest 18-room cottage, grew to about 44 rooms on Gloucester Bay. For those of you who have been there, you know that despite the fact that it's a, 45, however you're counting, room house. The rooms are quite intimate. It is an extraordinary place and a great kind of showcase of him as a designer. So these are the houses. They're all public museums. But of course, what I wanted to do with the book and with the show was to draw out kind of the queer narratives from the lives of these men and investigate the ways that that kind of manifested itself materially in their houses. And to do that, I turned to basically the kind of patron saint of this project, Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde is shown here in a caricature that was published in 1882 when he was giving a wildly popular American tour, a lecture tour that focused heavily on interior decoration. The reason I've gone back to Oscar Wilde here, and the reason why the very title of the book and the show is kind of a pun on his play, The Importance of Being Earnest. The reason why Wilde is so important to this story is that his sort of broadcasting of the message of the aesthetic movement from coast to coast, especially in his lecture tour in 1882, changed the way that Americans thought about their homes. He introduced the possibility that a bachelor, a single man, could not only, effectively create a home for himself, but you probably would not be surprised to hear that Oscar Wilde kind of insinuates that single men of means may be among the most appropriate to create a kind of an aesthetic environment. There was this belief that he had that homes should reflect your personal taste, your kind of personal kind of aesthetic mission. This is something that's gone right through us to this day, but it really overturned an earlier Victorian notion that the home was really essentially about marital life, about the raising of children, the inculcation of religious virtue. For Wilde, the home really was about the eye of the owner himself. And I say himself here in the sense that his celebration of what in the period was called kind of a bachelor home was uh, kind of a phenomenon that led designers like Sleeper and Codman and simply kind of residents in houses like Pendleton and Gibson to be both admired for kind of their good taste, but they were also suspect in the sense that Oscar Wilde himself was suspect. Certainly after his trial in 1895, Wilde's connection to kind of aestheticism and the idea of the sort of quote unquote bachelor interior became a kind of coded word for thinking about marginalized or queer men within this period. So what I'd like to do tonight, and I know I don't want to take up too much time because I would love to have a conversation at the end, is just to quickly take you all through the exhibition, give you a sense of the queer themes that came through, and then maybe this can spark some discussion. So if we start with Ogden Codman, um, Codman is really an interesting figure. We were able to, with both, with the first chapter of my book dealing with Codman and with this show, to talk about his dual kind of private and public persona by focusing on these two figures at the back, these two amazing 18th century portraits of his great-great-uncle and his great-grandfather. This gallery was called Double Vision at the Codman Estate because these two men were kind of guiding lights for Codman. His great-grandfather on the right was kind of an upstanding, kind of patrician New England Yankee, a family man, church-going. His great-uncle Richard at left, who was referred to as Bad Uncle Richard in the family, was the other guiding light from his kind of ancestral tree. Um, quote unquote bad Uncle Richard was a spendthrift. He was an expatriate. He loved living abroad. He was also something of kind of a sexual renegade. He was heterosexual, but he caused a number of kind of sexual scandals over his life. Increasingly over the course of his life, Ogden Codman Jr., who I think sort of aspired publicly to be more like his sort of Yankee patrician great-grandfather, said to relatives of his that he really felt that he had much more in common with Uncle Richard. And so when we organized this gallery, we put kind of the public-facing design career of Ogden Codman to the right. And to the left, let's call it the Uncle Richard side, we included things that really helped to reveal his private life, including the case here to the left, which caused a little bit of a stir because it included examples of Ogden Codman Jr.'s pornography collection. Believe me, this is the tip of the iceberg at Historic New England. Some rather tame examples, including an envelope that was sent him by a New York photo lab saying the law does not permit us to print some of these negatives. So it was kind of a breakthrough that I actually got to show a side of Codman that had never been seen before. I have to admit, I felt a real badge of honor that in my very first show, I earned an advisory warning label for this gallery that contains nude photographs that are sexual in nature. There's not really anything sexual going on in these images, but it was, I think, a bit of a breakthrough to be able to talk about him, kind of in this way. Codman was so well known in his own time as being a sort of Gilded Age designer, both for clients and for himself. This is his Villa La Leopolda, one of the grandest palaces ever built on the French Riviera that Codman built for himself. The story of La Leopolda has often been told, but what has not often been told is the relationship that he had with his personal secretary and companion, Ronnie Hadow, who you can see with Ogden Codman here. We know from Codman's letters that the impetus behind the building of Villa La Leopolda was very much Ronnie Hadow. Unfortunately, the two broke up over the building of this house. But it was a queer story that I thought was really interesting to invest within a larger narrative that had been told quite frequently about the creation of this house. So when we move to Charles Pendleton, the story is a little bit more difficult. We know far less about Charles Pendleton. Really, all we know about him was that he was a major collector of 18th century English and American furniture, and also that he was a high-stakes gambler. We know this because you can sort of see the two in unison. Whenever he really sort of bottomed out with his gambling, he would sell his collection. When he was riding high, the collection would come back usually better than it had been before. One of the reasons why he is such a mystery and became such a recluse is that what seems to have been a kind of gregarious young man comes to Yale, and in his first semester at Yale, he is expelled. And the reason was for improper conduct in relation to a female. And so a lot have taken this to say, well, he must have been some kind of Lothario. He must have gotten in trouble with a woman that he was involved with. The problem with that story is that, he never marries, he never has a public relationship with a man or a woman from this point forward that we know of. And when he moves into this house in 1897, gloriously furnished with his collection of 18th century furniture, very few people got past that front door. We have none of his private letters. He was a man who stayed at home and was devoted to his mother and to his collecting. So this is sort of the profile of Pendleton. When Pendleton dies in 1904, all of his collection goes to the Rhode Island School of Design Museum with the caveat that they recreate this house that he had moved into in 1897. What happens, however, is that in its translation to a public museum, what the RISD Museum did was to really sort of shift the story of him as a collector. The rugs were taken away. Most of his kind of B-grade paintings were taken out. And within his collection of furniture, which was quite representative of English and American antiques, all of the English antiques went into storage. The American antiques were put on display. And eventually, by about 1915, we're seeing this plaque put into Pendleton House thanking the original donor, who, by the gift of his collection, has left a notable contribution to the memory of colonial days. So suddenly, a man who had been a rather precious, and I use that in the best possible sense, someone who was really devoted to kind of the beauty of objects, was turned into someone who was, just sort of presented to the public as a patriotic collector, a supporter of early America. Collections like his vast collection of Wealden pottery, English ceramics, presented a problem for the museum. I mean, you had something like 78 different tea sets. And how do you square that with the notion of simply a patriotic American collector? Especially given that the aesthetic movement caricaturized men of his generation, and particularly bachelor collectors of his generation, for fetishizing ceramics and tea sets. In fact, Alice Morse Earle wrote in the 1890s, she was a great ceramic expert. She told a story in one of her great volumes about collecting china of a bachelor collector. But she talks about a young man who is collecting china in the same way that that Pendleton did, and she ends her story by saying, "It is needless to add that he was a bachelor." It's code. Everyone knows that this was kind of a queer activity. All right, our last two bachelors, and again, I'll try to be brief so that we can get to conversation. Henry Davis Sleeper can introduce to you all briefly. Um, Henry Davis Sleeper's creation of Beauport, his great masterpiece, really better than anything he ever did for any of his clients, was the result of a love story. And this is a love story that we really put front and center in the show. When you walked into that gallery, which was called Love and Magic on Eastern Point, you saw these two portraits, which had never hung together before. At left is Henry Davis Sleeper, and the smaller portrait on the right is a man named A. Piatt Andrew. The spark between these two men is really what started the house that we know as Beauport. In 1906, the two men were seated next together at a Boston dinner party in the spring. Piatt Andrew on the right invites Sleeper to his home on Eastern Point for lunch. And Sleeper just kind of never looks back. He falls head over heels for Piatt Andrew and for Eastern Point, and decides to build his own house there as close as he can possibly get to Red Roof, which was Piatt Andrew's home. As historians, we don't often get kind of the smoking gun letter, but this one is about as close as it gets. Um, in 1908, Sleeper writes to Piatt Andrew. He says, Arthur Little, who was a well-known architect at the time, says, has just written me a laudatory letter. Very flattering, haven't mentioned to anyone, even mother yet. He was another guy who was very close to his mother. The only reason I speak of it now is because, he said that he's been thinking that she'd never have taken the pains that he did, nor would Beauport have existed but for you. Beauport was a theatrical performance in a lot of ways to keep Andrew's attention, partly because, I'm sorry to say, this was kind of an unrequited passion. Piatt Andrew's taste did run to men, but to much younger, athletic, outdoorsy types. Poor Henry Davis Sleeper was much more of a kind of an indoorsy type. Not really Piatt Andrew's cup of tea, but the two men developed a very, very close and lifelong friendship. So to understand Beauport is really to understand this, kind of queer connection between these two men. So the last figure that I'll introduce you all to, and Megan has done a wonderful job talking about, how Charlie Gibson, as we all refer to him familiarly, sort of lived his life in some ways semi-openly as a gay man, as I found in my research. The Bard of Beacon Street, the gallery that was devoted to this prolific writer, looks at the ways in which this museum creator, who sort of turns his family home into this shrine, both to his family and also to his own literary reputation, was someone who was not always necessarily welcome in the house. We know that between about 1900 and 1916, due to his estrangement from his father, that Gibson was not particularly a welcome figure at the home. His father disinherits him, in fact, in 1916. And one of the reasons for this estrangement was Gibson's kind of infamous affair that all of Boston was talking about in the mid-1890s with Maurice de Talvan. He goes by about three different names. Maurice de Moni, Maurice the Count de Moni, a kind of title that he made up for himself. He claimed to be a French count. But at any rate, this was an intense relationship early on for Charlie Gibson. And it really led not just to, his reputation being sort of called into question in Boston, but his entire family was really sort of brought into this scandal. And the reason that we know that now is because I have to say, quite serendipitously, I was the one who ended up finding all of these letters that Ogden Codman Jr. was writing to Arthur Little, the architect I just mentioned in connection to Beauport. He's also writing to his mother. And despite the fact that Gibson did not keep any of his correspondence from this period with Maurice de Talleyrand, Codman sure had an awful lot to say about it. So he kind of lays out the affair, but while he's doing so, he's also making it clear that he himself, Ogden Codman Jr., is romantically pursuing Charlie Gibson. And in his pursuit, he is naming all of the other men in Boston that Charlie Gibson was having affairs with, both before and after Maurice de Talleyrand. So it was a gold mine that I was able to sort of find these and able to share them with Meghan at the Gibson House Museum. So what I love, and I'll just quickly say this about the book that you see on the right, is that Charlie Gibson, far from shrinking from the scandal, he doubles down on it. His first novel, Two Gentlemen in Touraine, is about a handsome young American, and who was more handsome than Charlie Gibson in the 1890s? Look at this man, who runs into an even more handsome and dashing French count and kind of their time in Touraine. So I love that he doesn't walk away from the scandal, but in some ways kind of embraces it with his first novel. So when he moves into the house after his mother's death in the 1930s, Charles Gibson essentially puts kind of a bell jar over the house, maintaining it as a sort of shrine, both to his literary reputation, but also to his family and their kind of position within Boston. But as Meghan pointed out, one of the things that I found really interesting in this house are the very subtle ways in which he imprinted his own personality. And I think there's a queer theme to be, sort of read here as well. By replacing whatever his father had had over the fireplace here in Gibson House, we don't quite know. We know that when he moves in, he places me over the fireplace. And it's not just me. It is beautiful young me, beautiful young me, beautiful young me. For those, aficionados of Oscar Wilde and the picture of Dorian Gray out there, the picture that Dorian Gray hung in the attic while, he remained youthful. Kind of the reverse thing is happening at the Gibson House. The portraits remain eternally beautiful and luscious. Arthur Little actually wrote to Ogden Codman once and called Charlie Gibson the juiciest boy I ever knew. And this is how queer Boston thought about Gibson. This is how Gibson thought about himself. And if you visited him here, and you can see him here later in life underneath all of these portraits of himself. In 2010, Hannah Barrett, who I mentioned, I'm glad you are here with us tonight, Hannah. In 2010, Hannah Barrett was commissioned to create a whole series of kind of imagined family portraits at the Gibson House Museum. And Meghan, maybe a little bit later, you can tell folks about the program coming up this summer to highlight these again. What I love about these really monumental, about 6 foot high paintings, a series of about 8 that Hannah created for the Gibson House Museum, is that she reclaimed Charlie Gibson really as kind of a queer icon. There are kind of gender bending, kind of dimensions to these paintings. We're seeing him partly dressed as, one of his female relatives with a big feather hat, partly, in the studio portrait that we also had in the show. He is also in his bathing costume at the family home on Nahant. And I just want to put a plug in here for the real importance of contemporary artists' interventions in historic house museums. They really get people to pay attention to houses in ways that they might not necessarily have done before. And I've said it before, I will say it again. This series of paintings is what started my entire project. I had never been to the Gibson House. I didn't know what it was. But when I went to Hannah's opening, it was Hannah herself who kind of collared me afterwards and said, "You have to write about this guy, and you have to write about Codman." And her sister then piped up and said, "Don't forget Henry Davis Sleeper." And kind of the project was born over a series of Manhattans. So I'll end by just saying a couple of quick words about the partnerships that we had. The great thing about this museum show was that we were partnering with RISD and the Gibson House Museum and the Cape Ann Museum to tell these stories. We were doing programming with, regular gallery talks. We did something during Pride Week at the very beginning, a really fun dress-up event for Cocktails with the Curator. We did virtual and in-person panels that looked at queer women's homes, a museum of her own, and the Museum of as Muse, when we looked at the ways in which Hannah and other artists have used, these museums as kind of inflection places to talk about queer history. And I was so glad that we ended the whole run of the show with a very well-attended, spectacular closing reception with the History Project. It was really great to start with Pride and then end with the History Project. And also to participate in satellite tours at these sites. So this wasn't just a way to introduce people to these new themes at this one show, but I was, regularly going to Beauport, going to the Gibson House Museum, going to RISD, and getting people at those sites to think with new lenses about these stories and these men. So I promised I would try to end a little bit. I think I went a little bit over the time I had expected to, but let me stop sharing here, and then hopefully we can all have a conversation. And Megan, do please let everyone know about what's coming up at Gibson House this summer.
Yeah, so I'll briefly say, as people are thinking about what they want to share with us or ask, that we are delighted to sort of reprise Hannah Barrett's show during the month of June, this 2025. Mark your calendar. We're going to have an artist talk on June 4th. We're going to show Hannah's work. We're going to put it so originally it hung in one part of the museum. What's so delightful about this work and to have it back in the spaces is that in some ways, it's a little bit of like a search and find. Like here are all these references in the painting. How can I find them in the spaces? And so we're really delighted to be able to put those up in the places that inspired them and kind of re-celebrate that collaboration with Hannah.
Thank you all so much again for this amazing talk. Wow, it was incredible. You had me like laughing and it was wonderful. It's the beauty of history, right? So everyone, I just want to give everyone a second. We're going to take a moment to do some Q&A. If you all need to drop at 8 p.m., please do so. We'll have a moment extra, if that's okay with the panelists, just to give people a moment to yeah, so I'm going to ask the first question, and then while everyone else is thinking, you can either write them in the chat or you can raise your hand and come on up and I'll bring you up. But my first question is that queer three-legged two-person chair. I'm like a queer theory nerd. I love queer theory, and if I were interpreting, I would have gone ham on that chair. Can you tell me more about it being featured so heavily right in the front of the exhibition?
So remind me what three-legged chair you're talking about.
Maybe it's just sticking out to me. It's this two-person three-legged chair in oh my goodness, it's the furniture guy, the gambling furniture man, in his section.
Pendleton.
Oh,
Pendleton. Maybe it's not that important, but for me, the oddness of the chair would have just jumped out as queer theory. Anyways, that's me.
Yeah, it is that settee, that double settee.
Yes.
What you're talking about. I mean, it's a little insider baseball, so I don't want to take up too much time here, but you are absolutely right that it is the short version of it is that he claimed it was the most valuable thing in his collection. And it turns out it was a complete fake. And it seems that he knew that it was a fake. And so in terms of like thinking about it through a queer lens, a lot of his collection was closeted. Like he knew things about his collection that other people didn't know about his collection. The same was true of his house. That house that got recreated at the RISD Museum, I was the one who, when I did a title search, I found out that he was a renter at the house. He did not own the house that was recreated, but he wanted to tell a story. And I think that's a lot of how kind of the closet got built for men of his generation.
Wonderful. All right, so folks, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or just raise your hand and I will bring you up to ask it. Okay, we've got one from the New York Historical Education. Was there anyone you considered including in the book an exhibition that did not make the cut? Ooh, that's a good question.
Well, yes. I mean, when I started doing it, there were, all sorts of friends came up to me and said, well, why aren't you doing this bachelor house? How come? Because there are many other examples of these kinds of homes. In fact, I just spoke at Vizcaya in Miami, that is the home of James Deering, um, uh, uh, totally of this time period. The reason why I chose these four guys was to create kind of a common denominator of men who were from the same region, the same period, the same class, who actually knew one another, to then sort of see how differently they created their worlds. But oh yeah, there are plenty more out there. And Will Fellow's book that I was talking about at the beginning of this, Will goes into a number of these in A Passion to Preserve. So there are plenty out there to be found. I would love to do like a volume 2 and a volume 3 where we do West Coast bachelors or Southeast bachelors. I mean, I think that would be a great thrill to do.
And I just want to say, Tripp, since Will's book, which has been so influential for me and people in the field doing this kind of research, there have been so many other houses that have come to light, or should I say, come out of the closet to tell these stories. And a lot, like Meghan said, and I was talking about with Historic New England, it took a long time and was up and down and not necessarily easy. But more and more are telling the stories, which I find really heartening.
We have another question from the chat. And then Hannah, I'll go to you with your hand raised. Is Ken Lustbader asks, is there an up-to-date list of potential reinterpretations out there?
Of historic sites?
Yeah.
Knowing Ken, that's probably what he's asking. And the answer is no. There isn't an updated list. I know people, a graduate student who was working on this, but there's nothing been published. I think one of the best sources, and I hope it's still online, I kept meaning to go and check, is the National Park Service study. I know Tripp has a hard copy. Keep that, Tripp.
Yeah.
That's the theme study. I don't know, Matisse, if you can find that, if it still is up on, but Ken knows that the National Park Service did several years ago. That's one of the best resources out there. And I think, I mean, the work that Ken did, New York is probably the best documented. But there is more work being done. It's just not, unfortunately, being coordinated. There's no one coordinating it.
Unfortunately, if you look at the NPS website, it is page not found. It has been removed.
I was afraid of that.
There is a book that it came out a few years ago, but The Queerest Places, which also that's the title. The author's name is just gone out of my head, but it does list many of these sites.
Right. Go ahead.
Yeah, Ken, I'm just going to bring you up really quickly just because you just to finish off this question, and then we'll go to Hannah after that. So let me add here. I'll pin you. There you
go. The theme study. Thank you, Ken, and thank you for this presentation. It was great to hear it direct from the source. The theme study was taken down by the Park Service as well as a number of other resources. The theme study is now on the Out History website, and all of it. It's huge. And as part of this grant I got from the Mellon Foundation, as Ken knows, we did this national survey, and I know that the Gibson House has responded. It's on our list. We are launching a website that is going to be sort of this national network. and it's going to have all the resources that are being taken down by the federal government. At least it will be there. And then we are also going to have a sort of listserv, sort of communication way to talk about this informally, as well as, it's not official yet, but we're launching a grant program with a limited amount of money for site-based LGBTQ history. So if anyone's interested, I'm going to put my email address in the chat to learn more. But anyone who's responded to that survey will be, receiving the information about it. So, but thank you for this. This is exactly what needs to be going on now. It's great.
Thanks, Ken.
Thanks. Good to see you.
Okay. So we're just gonna bring Hannah up. Where did Hannah go? There you are. Hannah, you ready?
Yeah, hi. I wanted to ask, and this is a question for all three of you, I think. Have you noticed any changes in audience? I mean, you're talking about how the interpretation has changed and how the museum has started to shift, the museum collectively. Have you noticed people, for instance, coming specifically to hear these? Meghan, you're talking about the Charlie Gibson Gay Boston tour. Tripp, maybe you had some experience with audience, throughout your programming around the book. And Ken, maybe you also noticed throughout all of these fluctuations some change in audience.
I mean, I'll say at the
Yeah,
Gibson,
Meghan, you're on the front lines
Yeah.
of this, so.
yeah, we really have, and it's been really great. Sometimes when I talk about this, people will ask about pushback, and for us, it's really been the reverse. That instead of people coming and saying, I don't want to hear about this, or wasn't expecting this, or whatever, it's kind of the opposite, where people are saying, I've been waiting for this. I'm so glad you're doing this work, and we find in particular that the audiences for Charlie Gibson's Queer Boston skew younger than our other audiences, which has been great and sort of demonstrates that. I mean, I think for a sleepy historic site, it can be hard to be relevant to a younger generation, and this might be a way for us to do that, and not just for a queer community, but for lots of people who just are interested in this history or interested in a broader narrative. So yeah, we really have.
And can I just add that, Hannah, good to see you, that with Beauport, which may have been the first house in America to interpret itself as a queer site, consistently they've done programming consistently that draws people, that brings them in. They do regular tours, it's part of the regular tour, but that's been really heartening to me. It's been really heartening to the staff, that has been consistent, because people do want to hear these stories. The research shows that people want to hear these stories. And I'm delighted to see that happen. And it's not, just queer men. I mentioned Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields. Telling those stories are really, really important too. And I think there are more stories out there that need to be told.
And
Yeah.
Pendleton House is due to be reinterpreted and kind of reinstalled in the coming years. There's talk about what to do with Pendleton House. And I think one of the challenges that the RISD Museum has had with Pendleton House is that, it's often perceived as a series of kind of staid and frozen period rooms with kind of tasteful furniture. And Pendleton himself, probably by his own design in a lot of ways, has been completely erased from the story. And one of the things that I was hoping might come about with this show is that in their reinterpretation, they might be tempted to tell a more complex story about the collector who created the collection, because I think it's so much more interesting. I love Chippendale furniture, but you can only sustain that interest for so long in a museum. Tell me about who put it together. I want to know about the 78 tea sets I want to know about, the kind of scam he was pulling in terms of, kind of his collection and who he was. So I do hope that that might bring new interest into a wing that I think is probably really due for a little goose.
Thank you.
Sure. So good to see you.
We have two more questions, and then I think we'll wrap it up there. I think these ones will be brief questions as well. Thanks again, Hannah. First one from Martha Breast: are there any bachelorette houses or museums other than ones that we mentioned that we know of for those who are curious about bachelorettes?
The one that I would recommend to you all is the Alice Austen House on
Yeah.
Staten Island. They are doing extraordinary programming there. The sort of queer history of Alice Austen and her partnerships is not only kind of front and center there, but the museum is doing really extraordinary things about reaching out to queer communities, doing queer programming, really sort of making it a focus for queer visitors who sort of are coming kind of like first in the minds of this house museum. But Sarah Orne Jewett is another great one. Ken, do you know of others?
Yeah, there are, but some are still struggling to tell the story. Willa Cather's house in the Midwest, in the community that it's in. I know from talking with people at the site, it's not been an easy story to tell in those communities. So yeah, there are others out there, and I urge you to go take a look at that theme study, which thank you, Ken, so much for, and I'm so glad that we can access it. That there will be listings of others, but those are the ones that just pop into mind right away.
Um, it looks like there's also a lesbian trans one in New Mexico. Maida, if you want to just pop that in the chat, the name of that would be wonderful. Our last question here for the panel is just about sources. Were you able to find these? Were you able to find the details of these exhibitions largely in cross-referencing private collections, or did you use archives to do this work?
For me, it was a lot of it was archival work. But and Megan can back me up on this too, and Ken too, in the work that you all do. Um, it is not easy to research the lives of queer people whose lives were not only censored by those around them, but who did an awful lot of self-censorship as well, who didn't want posterity to know about them. And so one of the ways that I talk about this kind of research to my students is that those plaster casts from Pompeii where they find like a cavity in the lava that was a person, and they fill it in to sort of find the victims of Vesuvius. I feel like sort of that was kind of my job as an archivist. Like I would find these gaps and these holes, and I would think something is happening here. There's a palpable absence around person X or around this year. And luckily, sometimes I actually did find the cross-referencing. The Codman-Gibson connection is a great example of that. Gibson saved nothing. Codman was talking about everybody, and he saved everything. And yeah, anyone who wants to get in touch with me, I can give you, I now have like a concordance of all of the Gibson references. And I believe that it is also our responsibility as researchers of queer material to share that information as widely as possible. Is not doing anybody any good to hang on to research that is going to be helpful maybe to someone else. David Doyle's research on the Codman papers is sort of how I found the trail that led me to his Gibson papers. If David Doyle hadn't written what he had on Codman, I never would have found them. So it's my great hope that if I leave a few breadcrumbs in all of these archives, someone else can come along and tell another story.
Thank you all so much again. I just want to note, Maida let us know it's the trans lesbian one in New Mexico is called Los Luceros near Santa Fe. So anyone,
great.
if you're checking out, if you're in Santa Fe anytime, go check that out.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much, Meghan, Ken, Tripp. Thank you so much for being here with the History Project and sharing what you know. We really, really appreciate it. Everyone give them a round of applause. And yeah, have a wonderful evening, and thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate it. If do y'all have anything else to plug at the end, or no?
Come and see the Gibson show, Gibson
Come and
House
see the
show.
Gibson show. Yeah, we have to do a collab on that this year. It'll be
Yeah.
great.
Perfect. Thanks,
Bye,
everybody.
everyone. Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.